Alright, hello everybody. This is Antonio Wolf. Seeing as my video the other day came out pretty well, I'm gonna do another driving video. This time through some hills that are much closer, but we shall see. Hopefully it's all fine and good. Roads around here are not as smooth as the ones over in the hills up by the lake. And apologies for the noise, but that's life. And this is on the way to what I consider to be the best road around here. I call it Negro Road because, well, that's what the map says. There's no sign around here actually, but the map says it's Negro Road. It's Spanish. Anyways, what can I yammer about? And there goes some squirrels. What can I yammer about? I suppose I should talk about what I've been working on at least since yesterday. One of my perennial interests is the philosophy of nature from Hegel. That is certainly something that I think most people would find curious because, philosophy of nature, that seems kind of weird. Why would anyone be interested in that? We got science today, right? We don't need philosophy to tell us what nature is. Science is what tells us that. Well, you'd think that. It's not really how it works. For the most part, science has been quite bad actually at telling us what nature fundamentally is. And science is pretty good at practical things, empirical science, that is. Philosophic science is something different. But empirical science can, at best, only play around with what works. And beyond what works, it doesn't know what to tell us about the universe. We have models, yes. But if you looked into science with anywhere, actually, any kind of theory whatsoever, you come to know pretty quickly that there's a bit of a facade there concerning the objectivity of science that most people believe in. And look at this road. This road is awesome. I'm telling you, it's the most beautiful road around here. Some nice curves, all nice hills. Look at those hills. And it goes up and down, all around, and some assholes were around here and threw some trash. You're not supposed to actually even park here, but I've seen some dumbasses parked here, and they're always out to do trouble, out to make trouble. This is why we can't have nice things, people. This is why we can't have nice things. But anyways, I keep going back to the philosophy of nature because it's fascinating. I love science, empirical science. I love learning about the world. And I am fascinated by conceptualizations of the world as such. I was aware of the conceptual issues and the conceptual natures of empirical science and its theories long before I read Hegel. But nonetheless, when I got to Hegel, Hegel provided something that before him I had given up on. Before Hegel, I had accepted that it's all castles in the sky, that there is no actual absolute truth that we can get through science. All we get is just, models upon models upon models with absolute presuppositions, and we can never certify that any of it is true. But with Hegel, we finally get a standpoint and a methodology which allows us to speak about things with an absolute perspective. Perhaps not an absolute certainty, that's a bit different. Although the conceptual certainty is absolute, but whether what we're talking about, what we think we're talking about, is something up to question. anyways, if you check out my blog, I have one blog going over chapter 1 of the Philosophy of Nature. It's a very fun one, in my opinion. You know, if you read that and you understand the methodology, it's rather fun to figure out, especially when you get to time, because time is the becoming of the philosophy of nature. Just something interesting to note: the second chapter of all the Hegel works that I've read have turned out to be the hardest. In retrospect, they seem so simple at first that you can just kind of move on and gloss over it. But when you go back, you realize that holy shit, no, that second chapter is almost they're really short, and 2, they are really difficult. And not just the second chapter. I mean, this is part of the first chapter, but it's that second concept that is like entirely the difficulty with almost all Hegelian works, and this difficulty precisely because they tend to be the dynamic concepts that first appear. With phenomenology spirit, you get perception, which is dynamically developed through the reflexive concepts of determinacy, and then with the science of logic, you get becoming, and becoming is a very wily and tricky concept that is not as simple as people think. It really isn't. But anyways, in the philosophy of nature, that concept is time, and time is so simple and yet so tricky. But if you look at what I have on my blog, I tend to have a bit of guts with regard to how I go about it, because unlike every other thing with Hegel, I was at far more liberty. Oops, just kind of went over a somewhat big pothole. Unlike everything else with Hegel, which is far more abstract, with the philosophy of nature, I feel at far more liberty to go off on my own and talk about things which Hegel himself cannot talk about because he's no longer alive, and those things were not around when he was alive anyways. And so I go off on tangents about modern science, modern theories of physics, all that jazz. And I say some things which are obviously very unorthodox. If you're a fan of science, so-called, you probably look at me as somebody who's insane and out of their minds. But believe you me, I have good reasons for the things that I say. I try to work out some of the reasons in my little comments on the philosophy of nature. Secondary stuff. And apologies for the noise, but that's the roads for you. But anyways, there is a work in progress that I have for a revision and update of that particular piece. And that has to do with a far more in-depth look at the kinds of things I was talking about in my first version. All the comments that I had have been expanded significantly, both the ones that are just pertaining to the logic which Hegel's working out, as well as the ones that pertain to my comments on modern science, particularly physics. Physics and mathematics are my two horses to beat, let's say, even though that's a bad phrase. I wouldn't beat a horse. I don't have the heart for that, and if you do, well, fuck you. But anyways, one of the particular things with mathematics is that Hegel also likes to whip on mathematics quite a bit. It's one of his favorite things to shit on, because so many people love mathematics and hold it in such high regard when it really doesn't deserve that regard. I mean, really, it doesn't. When you look into the nature of mathematics, you should be flabbergasted at how strange it all is. Not to say that mathematics is false to any extent. It's not. I mean, it's just a formal set of systems, formal set of rules, operations and symbols. And so long as you follow things through, and so long as you don't contradict prior things, you're good. Given that, however, mathematics is not a core to reality in the way people think. And so perhaps you have heard of this famous phrasing, and some people mainly hear from physicists, this amazement that math is so efficacious, so effective at describing nature. And indeed, this should baffle you. It should baffle you for various reasons, and one of them is a wrong reason, in my opinion. The fact that mathematics can describe reality, describe nature, should not in and of itself be baffling, because insofar as mathematics is a science of quantity, and anything that can be quantified, and plenty of nature can be, in various ways to certain extents, you can create equations about anything so long as you're talking about the proper relations and you know exactly what the functions mean. So in that sense, why would you be surprised that you can have an equation for gravity? Why would you be surprised that you can have an equation for the orbits of planets? That's actually not surprising whatsoever. What is surprising, what is absolutely baffling, or really not absolutely baffling so much as just an absolute piece of curious amazement, is that relations of mathematics itself correspond to reality. Not that you can do mathematical correspondences to anything that you want. You can create an equation for just about anything. I mean, look, there's shit like IQ, man. Statistical methods, blah, blah, blah. You can create an equation for whatever the fuck you want. But when something like the golden ratio appears in nature, when something like the Fibonacci sequence appears in nature, when something like pi appears in nature, when something like phi appears in nature, when something like the natural number, e appears in nature, when those things appear in nature, that is indeed baffling, because these are not relations which would seem inherent to just regular everyday objects. They are relations that we find only between quantities. That's how we discover them. And by the way, some things like pi, phi, e, they're called numbers. They're not numbers, in my opinion, because they can have no determination. They're called irrational numbers. Well, if you can't fully determine something with exactitude, you don't exactly have a number. You actually have I agree with Wittgenstein on this, that irrational numbers are not numbers. They are actually functions. They're actually operations that simply have no terminating finality. Apologies for seeming dark video. It's not so dark in my view, but the camera is trying to keep the sky in a nice clarity, and so it's choosing to darken the rest of the scene. But anyway, stuff like the golden ratio has to do with, and stuff like Fibonacci numbers and all these other numbers, which are pretty neat numbers in mathematics, which arise purely out of mathematical things. By the way, prime numbers relations as well appear. Stuff like the Riemann zeta function appear in nature. Those are the things that baffle. And those are the things that you should go, wow, how come that describes nature? How come that appears in nature? And those, for a large part, can actually be derived from geometry, particularly this type of geometry we could call sacred geometry. And that's part of the reason that I've been taking so long on my end to finish up my revision on the Philosophy of Nature blog, because the stuff on sacred geometry is so simple and yet so fascinatingly boggling. And sacred geometry is, in a way, what I see as basically what Hegel talks about when he says there could be a speculative mathematics of sorts. You know, beyond trying to ground mathematics in a speculative set of operations, which may or may not be worth much. I don't think anybody really cares. I think most mathematicians, frankly, don't care, which is a shame, but whatever. You know, math is math, it works. Speculative mathematics, I doubt, would be really better so much as it would be more intelligible. That would be the only thing that I would suppose is only really useful about it. Beyond that, you know, it works and it works. And even speculative mathematics could be extended to ways in which they're not intelligible anymore. But you know, the way mathematics functions formally doesn't give a fuck about that. Doesn't give a fuck about intelligibility, so long as you don't contradict things. And eventually you find that, you know, these other relations bring up other relations, come up later as something useful in operations, even if it's not intelligible in the world. But anyways, speculative mathematics. Let's talk speculative geometry. You know, like stuff like Platonic solids, for example. You ever seen that? You know, say you have a shape that's made of only of pentagons, for example. That's Platonic solid. You know, the tetrahedron, which is made of triangles of every face, equal size and shape, equilateral. That's speculative shape, and when I say that's a speculative shape, it's about the reflexivity of a universal. You know, the universal particularizes itself. So, you know, in 3 dimensions, the triangle determines itself as triangular as the tetrahedron. You know, like the triangle encloses itself and forms the higher order triangle, the universal triangle, of which all these other flat triangles are, you know, the moments or the parts. The cube does that with a square, the sphere does that with a circle, and so on and so on. And there's some interesting things to be said about the special case of 3 dimensions having more types of Platonic solids than, say, a higher dimensions would. You know, if you were in 4 dimensions, oh, stupid squirrel. It survived, it's okay. You know, if you're going past 3 dimensions, all the other higher dimensions end up being highly constrained and only have about 3 Platonic solids for themselves, and they all tend to be the higher versions of the cube, the tetrahedron, and I forget which other one. You know, and the higher you get, the less possible objects of those kinds that can exist. So 3 dimensions is kind of a sweet spot, interestingly enough. I don't know what it is with these squirrels. You just wanting to run across the street today. Pretty bizarre, if you ask me. But anyways, that realization that sacred geometry has to do with the reflexivity of shapes, as well as the reflexivity of operations, is most interesting. You know, and it seems to me that the fundamental basis of sacred geometry is the quantification of shapes as one and as the 1/2, at least to begin with. And you can get the derivations of these increasingly through just the reiteration. Holy shit. I hope I didn't run it over. squirrels suicidal or what? Like, it's like they're literally waiting for you to come so they can run across the street and die. Not something I want to do, but if it happens, it happens. I mean, look at this street. I mean, rather road. It's not a street, this is a road. This is actually one of the nice places to come and just have a walk. I came here the other day and I tried to make a recording of driving, but that's one of the videos that fucked up and I just kind of got frustrated. But let it go. And I was talking about science as well, by the way, just because it was fitting. But anyway, so say you have the circle and you want to relate the circle to the circle. How do you do that? Well, you know, you can put the circles immediately side by side, and you have that set of circles. And suppose that you want to have a circle which is centered at exactly the point at which they meet. And now you have a circle which hits the center of all these other circles. And suppose that you just want to keep that going, and you'll create some pretty interesting shapes. And you know, once you realize that these relations exist, you know, once you derive the half relation, which for the circle is the center point, you will easily start creating other points of order where you can then, because of the intersection of the circles, you can now have specific points of relation, and you will be able to derive the equilateral triangle. You will be able to derive from that naturally the Pythagorean triangle, and from that, even if you just in multiple ways actually, you can continue doing the derivation of either single shapes like circles or triangles, or you can start crafting these things like squares. And there's multiple ways that from then on to actually derive the golden ratio. And I know this because I spent last night about 5 hours just playing around on Paint, copying and pasting circles and crisscrossing lines here and there across points, and finding out, wow, you can actually come up with a lot of interesting other shapes which come out of sacred geometry and which have, you know, perfect geometrical determinations as well. So that's a very interesting thing, honestly. And Hegel's beginning of, or rather, the end of chapter 1 is a derivation of matter. It's Hegel giving a purely conceptual derivation and then giving a conceptual geometric derivation of matter as the circle turning upon itself, or enclosing upon itself, and you know, there you get the enclosure of matter through the movement of the plane upon itself in the circle. Here's a nice little creek which is got some good bit of water right now. Some horses. But anyways, that's it for sacred geometry, and that section is rather lengthy because it's a section on time, and apologies for picking up this, but got some water splashed, have to clean it up. And speed up a little bit to get the air flowing and get that dried out. And I'm still not finished because in part of that I talk about how the understanding of nature itself may actually hinge upon understanding the reality of sacred geometry itself, and how from that we can get so much of what we see as real measures in nature. And Hegel mentions in that section of chapter 1 about mathematics, and he says, look, there's a speculative mathematics that is probably possible. Not only that, the real interest of a speculative mathematics would be a science of measures. And this is particularly what I see in something like the science of cymatics. If you don't know what that is, look that up. Cymatics is basically the study of frequency in relation to matter. You know, if you get some material medium and you run a frequency to it, these material mediums will actually take shape, very specific geometric shapes depending on the frequency, and so there's sacred, and the frequencies are these sacred geometric frequency patterns. They're really awesome. Not only that, cymatics is also a consideration of the study of frequencies, not just in, homogeneous matter, but it's also the study of frequency in all forms of matter. We found that we know, for example, that something like the frequency of a cat's purr actually makes you heal faster. And so these frequencies are thought to be most interesting. Some people think that, for example, say certain frequencies in music or sound in general as the base of certain notes. For example, there's a strange esoteric debate between, should we change our tuning to 432 hertz from 440 hertz, which is what it is now. Because 432 hertz, if you put it into a cymatic visualizer, it will actually give you this amazing shape. Due to the sound, but at 440 will give you pure destructive noise. And there's some people who believe in some spiritual stuff and believe in frequencies and crystals and whatnot, and they think that this is highly meaningful. And I'm going to tell you right now, don't knock that crystal stuff completely. There's something to this idea of frequencies that is real. I mean, I'm not telling you that these people understand anything about what the hell they're talking about with crystals and good vibes or whatnot, but I am saying that it is indeed very clear to me, at least, that there is real evidence for significant effects that such things can have. And crystals, by the way, do have natural frequencies and resonances. And so, if a cat's purr can make you heal faster, imagine what something else may make you do. What is these sounds? There are sounds which are called binaural beats, or binaural beats. I don't know how, I think they're neural. And there are specific frequencies aimed at giving you some kind of experiential effect. And I can tell you, after having tried some of those, they do work. They don't work on everybody, but it seems they work on quite a lot of people, and they certainly have some effect on me. I mean, they make it a lot easier for me to fall into a meditative state, for example. So stuff like frequencies or whatnot also can appear as sacred geometries. They appear as multiples and measures of these things. Sacred geometry is also tied to other stuff like numerology. If you know anything about numerology has to do with beliefs in sacred numbers and whatnot. And usually, if you come, from the religious background, it just sounds like absolute nonsense. For the mathematical background, it sounds a lot more fascinating. But once you start getting scientific evidence that such things have a real efficacy in our world, a real effect, that starts getting very interesting very, very quickly. looking into all this other strange stuff. It's strange, but it's not false. It's not fake. I mean, as you can see me rambling for this long on this can go on for a long time if I really expanded everything in my writings. You know, I try to link to things in it. I've added visuals to what I'm talking about. But, you know, I'm trying to bring up this issue of, you know, maybe Hegel, you know, was kind of just trying to be clever, but at the same time, maybe Hegel also had this intuition that this sacred geometry stuff may actually be very fundamentally tied to the, well, nature of nature. And look at those hills. Amazing hills. It's a beautiful view. To leave that behind, because I can just keep rambling. You know, that's one of the things that I've been working on. I got fascinated by that yesterday again, and so I was doing quite a bit of thinking. Further stuff on science. Well, let's go through the philosophy of nature, basically in the beginning. Hegel says nature is the idea outside of itself. And if you look into the Hegelian literature, this is actually a very, very contentious debate, because people are not sure what to think about what Hegel himself thinks the transition from the science of logic to the philosophy of nature really is. I'm going to say something rather ballsy here, but considering what I do know of Hegel from my own personal reading experiences and what I've seen in secondary literature, I feel justified in saying it, and that is that I'm almost certain that most people, oh shit, never been here, by the way, just looking around, so let's see the views, and we'll turn back around as soon as I get a first spot or a second spot to turn around. But anyways, so I'm almost certain that the transition from logic to nature is probably extremely simple, and when you realize it, you probably feel stupid. But you know, the reason this is even a debate is because, frankly, most people who read Hegel don't seem to really have an idea of how it really works, which is a shame. It's a shame to say that, but that's just the truth of the matter. That, you know, you look through the literature and you don't find many people who can really explain what is going on. You know, they can describe things more or less, but they can't really explain it. And okay, you know, this seems like a pretty okay view. So, you know, that intuition of mine, however, is going to be left indeterminate until I manage to read and finish the science of logic for myself, because I can go to the very end and let me tell you, I really don't understand what Hegel's getting at. I have an intuition, I have a suspicion that the movement does not really change. You know, the way that things move doesn't change, but that doesn't tell you very much, by the way. It doesn't tell you how the transition really happens. It only gives you a formal abstract understanding of how it could happen, but to really get it, you obviously have to read it, understand the concepts, and do it, which I haven't done, and it would be a while before I really do it. It's a very, the science of logic is an unbelievably dense piece of work. And anybody who just reads it, in my opinion, is a fool. And if they claim to understand it, they are, they're claiming to understand it with like a first reading or even a second reading within just say like a year or 2 years. Anybody who says that is to me a veritable liar. That's not possible. It's impossible. You could do it if you let others do the thinking for you, yes. But you can't do it if you're actually working through that. You cannot burn through that book and understand it that fast. It's just not possible. I mean, honest to God, I've spent almost 2 years on just the beginning section of the logic, the first 3 chapters. Not even the first book, the first 3 chapters. And to digest that is an immense work. It takes time for you to really digest that intellectually and come to a grasp of how that really works. But anyways, okay, so the nature is the idea outside itself. And Hegel goes ahead and says, this is the concept of externality. And so he doesn't really go into the general conception people have that nature is the immediate other of the logical idea. Nature is the natural idea. One point to be made is that nature is not, the philosophy of nature is no longer about concepts, it is about ideas. Because now we're talking about instantiated concepts, concepts objectified, concepts which, are embodied already. And all right, next place I find to turn around, I will turn around because it's probably going nowhere. Although, let me tell you, wow, look, this road is smooth. Holy shit. It's a lovely road to drive on, If I had a motorcycle, I'd be coming around here. It'd be great fun. So, nature is the other, the idea. And people tend to also think about this in the way that they think that quality and quantity are opposites. But when you actually work through the science of logic, this doesn't really strike you. That the further you go, what you get is really a seeming concretization of lower elements. And so, people often will pit quality and quantity against each other as, immediate opposites, and then they're united in measure. But you work through quality up the way to quantity, and it sure doesn't feel that way, even though later on, you look back on it and you think about it, and you're like, huh, it was as if those two were concepts that were just side by side. But they aren't. Quality is contained within quantity. This is already its determination. So, it's not that logic and nature are side by side and they're brought back together by spirit. Rather, it's that nature is already, embodying logic. Whoa, it's some beautiful curves, but I gotta slow down, and I should turn around here. Nobody coming this time. road is so smooth. You talk about beautiful roads. I'll call this a beautiful road in the Hegelian sense too. This embodies the concept of the road perfectly. So there's some Hegelian autism for you. All right, so going back to what I was rambling about. Nature is the other of the logical idea. In that nature is not logic. You know, nature is not just a concept. Nature is not fully rational. And that is because nature is like the concept of the other compared to logic, which is the concept of something. And nature is the other of logic. But it is also the other of the other. But nature is the other of the other in that it begins with that otherness. You know, nature is already this. You know, nature is the idea as other to itself. It's the idea external to itself, and this can be understood logically in what we understand the other to be. You know, the other is the other of the other. So nature is the other of the other. It is the externality. You know, when things are external, they are external to themselves. You know, the idea is external, but it is external to itself. The idea is external to the idea, therefore, boom, self-externality. You know, this is the concept that unites that whole movement. You know, the idea othering itself. And if this is not clear, I am very aware that this stuff gets into a morass really, really quick. So apologies, go ahead and ask in the questions, and I'll try to clarify things either in another video or in the comments. But anyways, okay, so self-externality, first concept of nature. And Hegel says, well, what's the most immediate concept of that we have, you know, empirically? You know, what's the concept that we're aware of, that we can recollect from our knowledge of nature? It says, well, the most immediate one is actually space. Space is the first and immediate form of self-externality. You know, it's you don't need to refer to anything else. You know, space is not external to something else. Space is self-externality itself at its most basic. Interesting to note is that in prior versions of the philosophy of nature, before Hegel developed the science of logic fully, Hegel had his philosophy of nature begin with time and then not with space, and that he changed his mind because he realized that the differences of time, the otherness of time, is understood really spatially. You know, that we don't understand the moments of time as something temporal themselves. Rather, we understand them as spatial moments, which are differentiated through time, but themselves, you know, are not understood as time. You know, whenever we talk about a moment in time, we're really talking about a place, or rather a space. And when we're talking about a moment in space, or rather a part of space, we're really talking about just space itself. You know, we can have space within space, but within time, we don't have time. So that's a very interesting thing. But anyways, he goes on and says, look, you know, absolute space, just pure self-externality. What can we determine about it? And he makes some comments about how the ideas of absolute space by people like Newton were just plain erroneous. They don't make sense because space is not a thing. Space cannot be a reference. Space as such is not a reference point. You know, Newton believed in absolute space, which he thought was a reference point for motion of all things. So then you could actually know absolute motion related to this absolute reference point. But people like Leibniz said, well, that's nonsense. Space is completely relative and blah blah. And Hegel says, Leibniz was actually right on that one. Leibniz had a better insight. But Leibniz also misunderstood space because Leibniz thought that space wasn't really real. That space was just an external relation which existed parasitically on the real relations of the monads. And the monads were not spatially divided, but even though they were external to themselves, the appearance of space was just something that we projected onto the monads, or the world of the monads. And then Hegel says, well, this is an issue because it doesn't really make sense. Because if the monads are outside of each other, that outsideness is a spatial outsideness. He says that you can't have things outside of space and still claim that these things are separate from each other. Because in talking about that separation, that separateness, that externality of a monad from a monad, you're already presupposing the relationship with externality as such, and that relationship is space itself. So in trying to say space don't real, Leibniz nonetheless had to basically end up using space as real. I hope that the view is not so dark. And so that's interesting. And then Hegel goes on to derive the dimensional qualities of space, 3 dimensions. And by the way, he has no reason to stop at 3 dimensions. He could have gone on to 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 infinite dimensions. Mathematically and conceptually, that's possible. And as a matter of fact, we even know how those dimensions would function if they existed. Because the nature of space is, Hegel says, mathematical itself. Space is embodied mathematics. That is why mathematics can describe space so well. Mathematical quantitative relations obviously will appear in space because space itself is nothing but embodied mathematics. Mathematics is the indifferent difference. Quantity, actually, more specifically, is the logic of indifferent difference, a logic of otherness, which is not other. And what is space? The moment you go out away from one space or one point in space and you go to another, you've moved through space, but nonetheless that spacing out of space is exactly what space is, and so you're right back to space itself. In things being external, you go up the dimensions, and you can go in all these ways. You can get all these points, lines, planes, volumes, 4-dimensional volumes, 5-dimensional volumes, etc., etc. But all of these end up just being the exact same thing as just basic, plain old abstract space. They are all instantiations of the same logic of abstract otherness, of self-externality. And so, no matter how many spaces you go out of, you just keep coming back to the fact that you still stay in space. And the space is really no different at any place, at any level. It all collapses into an indifference. But anyways, why doesn't Hegel go on to 4th, 5th, and 6th dimensions? Because we don't have to. Why would we? There is no evidence whatsoever that such a thing exists. It's up to now only a hypothetical of theories of people crafting these higher dimensional geometries, but there is no determinate, definitive evidence that there is any hint of 4-dimensional space in which we reside. We have never encountered any 4-dimensional objects. We have never encountered anything 4-dimensional moving through our 3 dimensions in that way, and so on and so on. And then there's one guy, I think, the YouTube name I remember, it's called The Machian, German physicist. I'm trying to remember his name. I like him, but I can't remember his name. Alexander Unziker, talks about how, this talk about, hyperdimensional space is kind of nonsense. That even if you want to talk about, some weird things that might happen in our space, you wouldn't even have to appeal to 4 dimensions. You could actually just appeal to tangential 3-dimensional spaces on a 3-sphere, such that, we don't reside in 4-dimensional space, and nothing that will encounter us will be 4-dimensional, but rather that the 3-dimensional world is divided by 4-dimensional, or the moments of 3-dimensional reality, which we call time, are actually slices of 3-dimensional tangent spaces to a basically 4-dimensional sphere, or at least that's how I understand the 3-sphere. Not quite fresh on the exact terminology here. But anyways, so interesting stuff right there. So there's no reason right now that we have for thinking that there are these higher dimensions. Although, let me tell you, if there ever is any evidence, there are some people who are claiming that there is some evidence, and there's one thing that I've been looking for concerning the appearance of vortices on planetary bodies, where sunspots appear on the sun, and big tropical storms appear on the Earth, and it's the claim that they appear in other planets that we see, and it's this claim that these things originate and tend to stick to a range of a 19.45 latitude north and latitude south from the equator of these spherical bodies. And one of the ideas proposed about why this pattern may actually be a sign of a 4-dimensional reality is that they claim, and they give a source of the person they got it from. They don't give a source of what specific paper or chapter of a book they got it from, and so I can't find it because I've gotten a couple books by this guy, but I've searched through PDFs with word search, and I haven't found what I'm looking for, which is the claim that in a 4-dimensional sphere, which is rotating in 3 dimensions, what you get is the equivalent effect of 2 inverted tetrahedrons rotating in those 4 dimensions as well, within that 4-dimensional sphere, rotating in 3 dimensions, that these tetrahedrons will spin, that they will create vortices of spin at the points at which they touch the sphere from the inside, the center reaching out to the outside. And the points at which these tetrahedrons touch the sphere is exactly both at 19.45 latitude north and 19.45 latitude south. And so something like that would be fascinating. It's not a home run hit of evidence, but nonetheless it begins to become evidence of a 4-dimensional reality. I for one am not afraid of higher realities than our own. That would be fascinating to me. But so far, there's just no proof. And there's no evidence. Other things are time. There is a philosopher of physics, and he was also a physicist, who has a pretty famous talk. I've seen his talk a few times, posted around Reddit and all these in other places. And the people kind of go, "Oh boy, I love science." Usually point out to this kind of thing. This guy thinks that he can explain time by using the concept of entropy to explain why we have an arrow of time at all. And I've watched 2 of his lectures, and let me tell you, it strikes me as so strange that somebody could be so right in his deconstruction of why our regular notions of time are wrong, and yet be so wrong the moment it comes to his own version of trying to explain the nature of time. Because this guy attacks most of our common sense notions of time, and then when he tries to give his own answer, it's like he forgot everything that he said. I mean, seriously, it's like he forgot everything that he said. And it just strikes me as, how does that happen? You know, he was on the right track, and then he says this one thing, and he just forgets what he said. It's like he didn't remember all the things that he said, critiquing all the other views. And the problem I have with this view, and I still haven't added to my blog, but I want to add it to the revision, which is growing exponentially. Well, it's not growing exponentially, but it's growing increasingly complex and long, with all my comments and asides on top of what Hegel himself says, and that is that when he says that entropy explains the error of time, what he seems to completely forget is that the way we get the concept of entropy is only through time. Like, you don't get the concept of entropy except for, basically slingshotting yourself off a swing precisely on the concept of time. You don't get this idea of decreasing or increasing entropy unless you're already caught up in the directionality of time itself. Because you wouldn't even be able to derive this conception of entropy, which is a conception of a rate of change or a movement of change, without having temporal access to this change itself, because the change is already a temporal change. You don't get the idea of entropy unless you see entropy realized in time. So entropy cannot be an explanation for time. It's just not possible. Entropy can only at best be what it is. It can't explain time. It's basically what I'm getting at. Just not to ramble on aimlessly. Entropy cannot explain time. It's just not possible. Because in order to to use entropy to explain time, you already have to explain entropy through time, and therefore you have to presuppose a time before time, or a time of time, beyond the time that we exist, and you'd be caught up in the exact same issue, which is you're trying to explain time, and now you're using time to bootstrap yourself to explain time, and you can't do it. So I'll leave that here, and I went rambling a lot longer on things than I thought I would. Unfortunately, the video is so dark because it's focusing on the contrast of the clouds. Sucks for you, the viewer, but if I tried to refocus this thing, it would just get jittery. Leave you here. Gonna go walk Balboa Jr. See you around.